My name is Richard Mercer. I'm 65 years old, a retired intelligence officer, and for most of my adult life a man. People didn't see, at least not for who I really was. This story begins on a humid September morning just outside a naval base in Virginia. The sky was blue, ceremonial flags flapped crisply in the breeze, and the courtyard buzzed with a familiar cadence of honor, guard salutes, and sharp heels on stone. It was my daughter's big day, Colonel Elizabeth Mercer, the youngest female officer in her unit, to receive full command. An impressive career, a proud moment, a moment I had no intention of missing. I wore a simple gray suit, no medals, no ribbons, just a clean white shirt, pressed slacks, and polished shoes. I had even taken time to trim my beard and shave close old habits from my service years. I arrived early, hoping to find a good seat, and perhaps a quiet moment with Elizabeth before the crowd arrived. But as I approached the gates, a young officer with a clipboard stepped in front of me. "Sir," he said firmly, but politely, "I'll need to check your name on the list." "Richard Mercer," I answered calmly. He nodded, scanned the sheet in his hand, then checked the digital tablet beside it, his brow furrowed. "I'm sorry, sir. You're not listed." I let the words hang in the air for a moment. "Are you sure?" I asked, not defensive, just curious. He hesitated, then double-checked. "Yes, sir." "You're not on the VIP access list or the family list." Behind me, I heard a voice I recognized. My son-in-law, James, Elizabeth's husband, sharply dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, stepped up beside me, glanced at the officer's tablet, then turned to me with a thin smile. "Must be a mistake," he said. Then under his breath, "Maybe you didn't RSVP properly." I looked at him, not angry, just tired. That kind of tired you feel when something you feared would happen happens exactly the way you imagined it. "It's all right," I said quietly to the officer. "Must be a mix-up. I can wait." James gave me a half smile and patted me on the shoulder, as if I were some confused senior at a high school reunion. Then he turned and walked inside. I stepped back from the gate, standing off to the side behind a row of hedges that bordered the ceremonial courtyard. From there, I could see everything. Officers taking their seats, families fussing over medals and uniforms, photographers lining up. My daughter, radiant in her formal whites, was already at the far end of the stage. She looked confident, in control, the embodiment of everything the Navy wanted its leaders to be. She didn't see me. I didn't wave. I adjusted my collar and quietly accepted the sting rising in my chest. This wasn't new. I'd been absent from most of her professional milestones. Not because I wanted to be, but because I was always somewhere else. Classified operations don't come with photo ops. Intelligence officers don't show up on promotion posters. And over the years, the distance between us, physical, emotional, even moral, had become part of the routine. I understood why. My work required silence. Her path demanded visibility. We lived in different kinds of service. Still not being listed today of all days felt like a kind of final punctuation mark. Then it happened. A long black SUV rolled to a stop near the officer's entrance. The driver stepped out, opened the back door, and out stepped a tall man in full uniform. Medals heavy on his chest. 4 stars on his shoulder. Admiral Lawrence Keating. I hadn't seen him in over a decade. He scanned the crowd, then spotted me near the hedge. His face broke into a grin, and to my absolute disbelief, he made his way toward me. The young officer at the gate straightened instinctively, snapping to attention as Keating approached. The Admiral clapped a hand on the gate guard's shoulder and said loudly enough for several heads to turn, "This man's not on your list." "That's probably because your list is incomplete." The officer blinked. Then Admiral Keating turned to me, extended his hand, and said, "Clear as a bell at last. Admiral Mercer, your seat is in the front row." The words didn't echo, but they didn't need to. People nearby froze. James, mid-step with a drink in hand, turned abruptly. His smile disappeared. Across the courtyard, Elizabeth looked up. Her face shifted almost imperceptibly from confident to confused, then to something else, something pale, something raw. My ex-wife, seated elegantly in the second row, tilted her head slightly and whispered to the woman beside her, Admiral, and then the air changed. The way it does when someone realizes they've just misjudged the entire weight of a room. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. I adjusted the sleeves of my coat and followed Admiral Keating past the stunned crowd toward the front row of dignitaries. As the world around me, my old world and hers, began to rearrange itself in silence. It had begun. They say a father never really leaves the lives of his children. I used to believe that, but I've learned over time that there are many kinds of absences, and not all of them are physical. After the ceremony, people would ask me, "How did you go unnoticed for so long?" The truth is, I didn't hide. I just stopped being visible to the people who decided I was no longer worth seeing. I wasn't always invisible. In fact, there was a time when I was the center of my daughter's world. Elizabeth used to run into my arms when I came home no matter what hour. Her tiny boots would thump against the hallway tile as she yelled "Daddy" with the kind of joy only children know how to give without hesitation. I remember one night in particular, she must have been 10. I came home from a 6-month deployment. She had fallen asleep on the couch, holding a welcome home sign she drew with crayons. It was all navy blues and stars. The word Admiral was spelled wrong. I never corrected it. Back then she saw me as larger than life. But time and silence do strange things to memory. When I left the Navy, I transitioned to federal intelligence. At first I thought I'd do a couple of years and retire quietly, but I had a knack for operations, particularly the kind that stayed off radar. Black site negotiations, infrastructure sabotage, digital warfare in places people couldn't pronounce. My job required silence, long hours, discretion above everything. And with that came distance, from my friends, from Elizabeth, from the public world entirely. I didn't attend her high school graduation. I didn't walk her down the aisle. And when she got her first command post, I mailed a short letter with no return address. I didn't even sign it, Dad. Just proud of you. Keep your boots on the ground. Eyes forward. I know what that looks like from the outside. My ex-wife Camille once told a neighbor that I had vanished into whatever retirement looks like for men who can't let go of the uniform. It wasn't true, but I didn't blame her. She'd spent a decade raising our daughter alone. I had missed birthdays, promotions, recitals, and I never offered an explanation. Not because I didn't want to, but because I legally couldn't. There are things you can't say even when you want to. I remember one Thanksgiving, must have been about 15 years ago. I flew in unannounced and stopped by the house just to drop off a gift. Elizabeth was already a cadet at Annapolis by then. I stood on the porch for a moment, listening to the laughter inside, then left the box at the door. Inside was an antique compass engraved with the words, "Steady course, no matter the current." I found it on eBay 6 months earlier, cleaned it up myself, wrapped it carefully. She never acknowledged it, not even a thank you. Years later, I found that same compass in a photo of her office desk in a Navy Times feature. The article was about rising female commanders. The photo was small, but the compass was there next to a stack of books and a coffee mug. That was enough. Still, I wasn't blind. I saw the shift. Elizabeth had grown into someone I didn't quite recognize. Her posture changed. Her tone became clipped formal. She no longer signed birthday cards with love. Her emails, when they came, were polite, short, professional. She no longer introduced me as her father. I was Richard. Just that. At a Navy gala 10 years ago, I ran into an old friend of mine, Vice Admiral Shelby. He told me he had met my daughter at a Pacific Fleet exercise. "She didn't mention you," he said, almost as an afterthought. I figured maybe she had a different last name. She didn't. She simply chose to erase me. I don't think it was malice. I think it was protection. Maybe embarrassment. Maybe she thought I was just some quiet former enlisted man with a pension and an old Navy ID card. To her world of polished brass and political optics, I didn't fit the image. No bio on military.gov, no press releases, no war stories. But what she didn't know, what no one knew, was that I'd never really left service. I had been part of 6 international de-escalation operations. My name was coded behind strings of numbers and clearance levels. I had sat in rooms where policy was shaped, where hostages were freed, where nations were steered back from the edge. And yet I was never the one at the podium. I was the man standing just behind the curtain, always out of frame. And I chose that. For years I told myself it was worth it, that anonymity was the price of duty, that if my daughter rose through the ranks believing she did it on her own, it would make her stronger. But some nights I wondered if I had made a mistake. One night not too long ago, I was sitting alone in my small apartment in Alexandria, watching a live stream of a defense panel where she was testifying. She looked sharp, controlled, unshakable. At one point, a senator praised her preparedness and asked, "Where do you think your sense of strategic instinct comes from?" She smiled. "A few mentors along the way," she said, "and maybe just good instincts." I turned off the screen. I didn't need her to name me, but I also knew she never would. That was the life I had chosen, one where impact mattered more than credit, where duty came without applause. Still, I'd be lying if I said it didn't hurt sometimes, to be forgotten, or worse, dismissed. And so when I stood outside her promotion ceremony that morning, not listed, not expected, not even acknowledged, it didn't surprise me. But what surprised everyone else was that I was never meant to sit in the back row. Not that day. Not anymore. They always say he came out of nowhere. That's never true. I didn't come out of nowhere. I came from operations buried so deep, most of the men who authorized them were ghosts by the time the files were declassified. I came from war rooms without Windows flights, without manifests, and briefings that ended with a burn order. People like me didn't wear our legacy. We carried it in silence. After I left the Navy, I was recruited by a joint task unit focused on international destabilization threats, cyber espionage, insurgency, funding, political subversion. I wasn't the most senior or the most academic, but I had a talent for seeing patterns others overlooked. I learned fast. I adapted faster. Within a year, I was running black cell simulations. 2 years later, I was leading operational forecasting for preemptive response across 4 continents. If someone asked what I did, I'd say consulting and leave it there. One mission in particular still lives under my skin. It was 2004, East Africa. A small coastal government was on the brink of being overtaken by a coalition of military-backed traffickers groups that moved arms and bodies with equal indifference. The U.S. couldn't intervene publicly. We had no embassy, no treaty, no press coverage, not even plausible deniability. But we had me, and a 4-man team, none of whom existed on paper. We sabotaged the supply chain, rewrote digital manifests, and fed false routes into local systems. 1 week later, the coup collapsed without a single shot fired. To the world, it looked like a regional misfire. To me, it was a silent victory. I didn't get a medal. I didn't want one. But months later, a note arrived in a sealed envelope. No address, no return name. Just one sentence on White House stationery: "You held the line when no one knew it was breaking." I kept that letter, framed it, tucked it behind a row of dusty books in the back of my apartment. I never showed Elizabeth. Not because I didn't think she'd be proud, but because by then she no longer asked. She was building her own path, rising fast. Field Command Fleet, Command Staff Command. Her name appeared in military newsletters, internal memos, even the occasional headline. She was exactly what the modern Navy needed: polished, poised, politically fluent. And I couldn't be farther from it. The further she rose, the less room there was for a man like me in her story. I didn't belong in the polished family photo at her award dinners. I didn't fit in the narrative of a modern female trailblazer whose father people assumed had been ordinary at best or absent at worst. But the thing is, she did follow me, even when she didn't know it. She applied to Annapolis the year I finished chairing a security reform commission there. She aced her strategic theory final using doctrines I had helped draft under anonymous contribution to the Naval War College. Her first deployment map, almost identical to the covert model I designed for South China Sea maneuvering in 2010. She was walking my path, only with a spotlight I never wanted. One day I visited the Navy Memorial while she was on an overseas mission. I walked the entire plaza twice, read every name on the wall. Mine wasn't there. Of course it wasn't. You don't engrave men like me. But I wasn't bitter. I watched tourists take pictures in front of bronze sailors and grand flags. I smiled at a kid in a junior ROTC cap asking his mom if he could be a sea captain one day. I stood quietly letting the breeze pass. Then I walked 3 blocks to a building most people didn't know existed, swiped into a sub-level archive no journalist had ever entered, and handed over my last operational brief. It had been years since my name had appeared on a live asset file. I was done. They asked if I wanted a retirement ceremony. I declined. They asked if I wanted an internal commendation. I said no need. What I truly wanted was simpler than all that. I wanted to sit quietly in the back of a crowded room, watch my daughter reach the pinnacle of her career, and smile. That's it. I didn't want fanfare. I didn't want a salute. I just wanted to witness the moment she stepped into her full command. But fate, it seems, had other plans. Because someone had been watching. Someone had remembered. Someone who had once stood beside me in a sand-blasted forward base bleeding from the shoulder, whispering, "If we make it out, I owe you more than I can ever repay." Admiral Lawrence Keating. That man did not forget. It was he who arranged my appearance that day. It was he who submitted the confidential nomination for Admiral Emeritus status, an honor rarely given and even more rarely acknowledged publicly. But he knew the ceremony would be attended by dignitaries, allies, enemies, and admirers. He knew that if Elizabeth was to stand tall, then the foundation beneath her me needed to be revealed. Not for pride, for truth. And that's what shattered the silence that morning. Not arrogance, not revenge, but truth, long hidden, long denied. Finally returned to the surface like a submarine rising out of cold waters, its shadow undeniable. I hadn't come out of nowhere. I had always been there. But now they were finally looking. I didn't walk fast toward the front row. That kind of moment doesn't require speed. I moved with the quiet certainty of a man who no longer needed to explain himself. Admiral Keating led the way, parting the ceremonial crowd like a slow-moving tide. People rose instinctively. Some whispered. Others froze mid-conversation. I heard a wine glass clink onto marble, unheld for too long. Admiral Mercer, a young officer, said softly, eyes wide as I passed. That was the first time I'd heard my full title spoken aloud in public. It hit harder than I expected, not because I craved recognition, but because for decades that part of me had only existed behind closed doors and locked screens. I sat in the front row, 2 seats down from the Chief of Naval Operations. Keating gave me a small nod, then took his own seat beside me. No words exchanged. None needed. From where I sat, I could see Elizabeth clearly. She stood at the edge of the stage, just behind the podium. Her back was straight, shoulders squared. But her eyes, those sharp, focused eyes I had seen in photos and interviews, were flickering now. Not wildly, not fearfully. Just enough to suggest that her foundation had tilted. The room settled. A commanding officer stepped forward, welcomed the guests, delivered the opening remarks. Applause followed. A band played a brief arrangement. Then it was time. The announcer's voice came over the loudspeaker. Please welcome to the stage Colonel Elizabeth Mercer, recipient of today's command promotion." Elizabeth stepped forward. The room applauded again, polite, patriotic, respectful. She took the podium and adjusted the microphone. Her voice, when it came, was clear, measured, trained. "Thank you all for being here," she began. "This moment represents more than just a promotion. It represents legacy, sacrifice, and the support of those who made this possible." She paused. Her eyes moved across the crowd. Briefly, they landed on mine. She didn't blink, but her mouth pressed into a tighter line just for a second. "I've been fortunate," she continued. "Fortunate to have had incredible mentors, leaders, and colleagues along the way. No mention of me. Not yet. I want to thank my husband James for his constant encouragement." A few nods. Camera shutters clicked. My mother Camille for raising me with strength and discipline. Another pause. Then silence. It stretched, longer than it should have. She looked down at her notes, then back up. And for the rest of my family, she said, eyes narrowing slightly, "Thank you for shaping who I've become, both through presence and absence." A few heads turned. Keating shifted slightly beside me, then leaned in. "She's adjusting," he murmured. I didn't respond. I simply watched. The speech continued, brief, professional, effective. But the emotion, it had shifted. The energy in the room had changed. By the time she finished and stepped back, the applause was hesitant. Not weak. Just unsure. Then Keating stood. Before we conclude, he said, turning to the podium without a script, "I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge someone whose presence here today is both long overdue and entirely necessary." The room hushed. Richard Mercer is not a man most of you have seen in headlines or press conferences, but you've seen the effects of his work. You've benefited from the policies he authored, the operations he protected, and the decisions he made in rooms most of us will never enter. He paused. Over 3 decades, Admiral Mercer served this country with distinction across multiple intelligence branches. His work prevented wars you'll never read about. His strategies reshaped the doctrine we now teach at the Academy. I felt the weight of every silence I had ever carried settle in my chest. And today, Keating continued, we recognize him not with a rank of command, but with a rank of legacy. A junior officer stepped forward holding a small velvet box. Inside was a single silver insignia mounted on navy blue silk. On behalf of the Department of Defense, the Joint Chiefs, and the generations of officers who unknowingly followed in his shadow, we formally present Admiral Richard Mercer with the distinction of Admiral Emeritus Intelligence Command. The room erupted, not in wild cheering, but in something deeper, rising, clapping, heads turning. Elizabeth didn't move at first. She just stood still, hands folded in front of her. Then slowly, as if something inside her cracked open, she stepped off the stage. She walked down the aisle. Not quickly, not with the posture of command, but with the quiet hesitation of a daughter standing in a moment she never prepared for. She reached the front row and stopped. We looked at each other. There were no cameras now, no microphones, no pressure, just the two of us. "Dad," she said, barely audible, and that word "one" I hadn't heard from her lips in over a decade hit harder than the rank, the box, the applause. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" she whispered. I looked at her, my voice steady. "Because you didn't need me to be important. You just needed to know I never left." She nodded, blinking fast. "Can I?" I nodded toward the empty seat beside me. She sat. The rest of the ceremony played out around us, presentations, announcements, closing remarks, but none of it reached us. We sat together shoulder to shoulder, the distance of years closing inch by inch. When it ended and people stood to leave, she turned toward me again. "I had no idea," she said. "No idea who you were." I shook my head gently. "You always knew who I was, you just forgot." Her hand brushed mine lightly. Not forgiveness, not yet, but contact, connection. And in that moment, I realized something that hadn't occurred to me all day. This wasn't just my return. It was hers too. The ceremony ended, but the story didn't. Outside the reception hall, the air smelled faintly of cut grass and warmed stone. Officers chatted in clumps under white awnings. Dignitaries posed for polite photos. Champagne glasses clinked. The kind of formality that follows after a storm of surprise, a current of tension still rippling beneath the surface. Elizabeth stood beside me in the corridor, her posture straight but her gaze unsteady. "Walk with me," she said. We stepped away from the crowd, moving down a long stone path lined with hedges and memory. The further we got from the buzz of conversation, the quieter she became. And finally, when we reached the edge of the courtyard, where the crowd thinned and the ceremony felt like a distant echo, she turned. "I don't know where to begin," she said. I didn't say anything. I waited. She looked down at her shoes, standard issue, perfectly polished, then back at me. "All these years I thought you were just some quiet man who disappeared when things got hard. I thought Mom raised me alone." I nodded once. Not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "She did a lot," I said, "and so did I. Just not in the same room." "I told people you were retired," she said. "I told them you didn't do much after the Navy, that you were a technician or something." Her voice broke slightly on the word technician, like she had rehearsed it too many times, and now couldn't believe she ever said it. I gave a small smile. "You weren't wrong. I was technical, just in a different way." She winced. "Dad, I was ashamed." That one hurt. She didn't say it for drama. She said it because it was true. "Why?" I asked gently. "Because you didn't look like the people I was being told to emulate," she said. "No press conferences, no medals, no titles. I needed to prove I belonged, and you didn't fit the version of success I was building." I let the honesty settle between us. "You were building your name," I said. I didn't want to interrupt that. "But I erased you to do it," she said. "That's not the same." For a long moment we stood in silence. A car drove by in the distance. A bird landed on a railing nearby. Then she whispered, "Why didn't you ever tell me I couldn't?" I said. "Not just legally, but emotionally. If I had told you what I really did, you would have carried it like a shadow. I wanted you to move in sunlight." Her jaw clenched slightly. "But I didn't. I moved in doubt. I spent years wondering why you weren't more present, why you missed every milestone. I thought it meant I wasn't worth showing up for. That more than anything felt like the deepest wound." "I was at more of your milestones than you think," I said quietly. "Just not in the pictures." She looked up. "You were there?" "First day at Annapolis," I said. "I was the man standing across the street at 5:00 a.m. When you gave your first public address at Fleet Week, I was in the third row of the upper gallery wearing a ball cap." You never looked up. She covered her mouth, inhaled sharply. "Why?" "Because showing up quietly was the only thing I had left." I said. "You didn't want me visible, so I became background. But I never stopped being there." She didn't speak for a while. Her hands were clenched, her shoulders trembling slightly beneath the pristine white uniform. "I think I hated you sometimes," she whispered, "and now I feel sick about that." I nodded slowly. "You were allowed to feel what you felt. You were missing something, but now you know what it was." She let out a small, broken laugh. "You've saved lives, haven't you? Prevented things we'll never know about." "Yes," I said. "And I was angry because you missed a birthday party." I didn't correct her. I didn't lessen her pain. Because to a daughter, sometimes a missing chair at the dinner table speaks louder than a foreign war. "You didn't fail me," she said suddenly, voice firm. "I failed to ask who you really were." We stood facing each other for a long moment. Then she asked, "Can I fix this?" I said gently. "But you don't need to. We're here now. That's what matters." Her eyes welled up. But she didn't cry. Elizabeth Mercer doesn't cry in uniform. Instead, she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled something out, a small, worn compass. My heart stopped for a second. "You sent this," she said, "15 years ago, no note, no name. I almost threw it away. But something told me to keep it." I took it from her hand, slowly opened it. The same engraving was still inside. "Steady course no matter the current. You found your way," I said. She nodded. "Because of you, even if I didn't know it." I handed the compass back to her. She slipped it back into her pocket like it was armor. "Come to the family dinner tonight," she said. "It's informal, small, but I want them to know who you are now." I thought about it, and then I said, "Only if we stop pretending I ever left." She smiled, small but real. "Deal." We turned back toward the reception hall. The voices were louder now. Someone had started a toast. A photographer was calling out names, but for once we didn't rush to rejoin them. We walked slowly, not as commander and guest, not as speaker and honoree, but as father and daughter, two people finally facing the same direction. That evening, I found myself standing at the edge of a familiar driveway. Same house, same brick siding, same porch light flickering just slightly too bright. I hadn't stepped foot inside this place in nearly 10 years. The last time I was here, it was for a brief stop, dropping off a birthday gift no one acknowledged. I had stood on this same patch of lawn, watching through the living room window as my daughter opened boxes of neatly wrapped presents from people who fit better into her life than I did. Now I had been invited back. Inside the home was warm, crowded with too much furniture and not enough emotional space. James, the son-in-law who once greeted me with smug indifference, stood near the bar cart, pretending not to glance in my direction every 30 seconds. Camille, my ex-wife, moved between the kitchen and dining area like a hostess balancing pride and unease. There were only 6 people in the house, but the tension made it feel full. Elizabeth ushered me inside, her hand lightly resting on my back. A subtle gesture, polite, almost practiced, but I felt it. A bridge being rebuilt 1 inch at a time. James offered a stiff handshake. "Glad you could make it," he said. I didn't respond with sarcasm or judgment, just "thank you." And that seemed to disarm him. He blinked once, nodded, and turned toward the wine bottle like it had said something interesting. Dinner was simple. Roast chicken, asparagus. A dish Camille used to make on quiet Sundays when things were better, before the silences turned permanent. Conversation started clumsily with politics and traffic and some recent promotion in another branch of the family. No one mentioned the ceremony. Not at first. Until Camille placed the bread basket on the table and finally sat down across from me. "You kept quite a secret," she said softly. I met her gaze. There was no challenge in it, just uncertainty. The kind that lives in people who realized they'd been telling the wrong version of history for a long time. "It was part of the job," I said. She nodded slowly. "I thought you just faded, that you didn't want to be involved." "I was involved," I said, "just not in ways you could see." James cleared his throat. "Why didn't you say anything when Liz started rising through the ranks because she needed to make her name cleanly?" I said, "not as someone's daughter. She needed to believe she earned every inch of it on her own." And she did. Elizabeth cut in firmly. "Don't make the mistake of thinking he paved the way for me. He didn't move obstacles. He just showed me they were survivable." That shut the table up for a moment. Camille looked down at her plate. We had no idea. "I know," I said. "That's the part that stings even now." No one replied. Then carefully, Elizabeth reached beneath the table and placed a small frame beside the centerpiece. Inside, it was a black and white photo of a much younger me taken during a classified mission, one I recognized only because it had been declassified 2 years earlier. Below the photo, she'd added a small engraved label, Admiral Richard Mercer. Service without applause. Camille stared at it. Her expression cracked just slightly. "I always wondered what happened to the man I married," she said. "I didn't disappear," I replied. You just stopped asking where I'd gone. She nodded slowly. That's fair. James shifted in his seat, uneasy. The Admiral title is that official. Elizabeth gave him a look. It's honorary, reserved for those whose contributions don't fit within normal ranks. He blinked. So, you outrank us both. I looked at him carefully. I don't think of it like that. Rank is just a language people use to measure proximity to power. I measure differently now. He gave a small chuckle, then a quiet. Fair enough. After dessert, Elizabeth and I sat outside on the back porch. The oak tree we planted when she was a kid still stood tall branches stretching across the yard like an old memory refusing to fade. She handed me a glass of water, then pulled her feet up into the chair like she used to when she was a teenager, unsure how to speak without breaking something. I always thought I was the one carrying the family name, she said. You were, I said. And you did it well. But the truth is, I was only carrying half of it. The part I could see. The part I thought was worthy of the spotlight. And now I realized that the foundation I stood on wasn't invisible. It was just silent. We sat in silence for a while after that. Then she said something I never thought I'd hear. You saved me, didn't you? That operation last year, the Gulf mission. We lost communication for 20 hours, and the carrier was redirected at the last minute. You rerouted us, didn't you? Yes, I said. Her voice broke. And I didn't even know it. You weren't supposed to, I said gently. Why? Because I'd rather you be alive and angry at me than dead and grateful. She laughed through her tears. That sounds exactly like you. We stayed there a while longer, watching the porch light buzz against the quiet sky. Inside, the family carried on faint voices, clinking dishes, small reconciliations happening without fanfare. But out here, it was just us. Not as decorated officers, not as the person who left and the one who stayed, but as two people who had finally seen each other clearly, perhaps for the first time. Not with medals, not with titles, just with truth. A week later, I received a call from the Naval Academy. They were holding a closed seminar for their advanced leadership cadet students preparing for high command paths. They wanted me to speak, not about tactics, not about operations, about legacy. It took me 3 days to agree. Not because I didn't want to, but because I wasn't sure I had anything left to say that hadn't already been lived. When I finally stood in front of that room, 60-some cadets in crisp uniforms, eager eyes postures caught between discipline and curiosity, I didn't begin with my title. I didn't talk about my record. I began with a single sentence. For most of my career, I was the man no one remembered. They didn't know what to do with that. It wasn't part of the template. There was no badge for anonymity, no ribbon for silent sacrifice. I told them about maps with no names files, with redacted paragraphs, missions never listed on any after-action report. I told them about doing the right thing when no one's watching, and worse, when no one even believes you were there to begin with. I told them about watching my daughter grow into the woman I knew she could be, without ever getting credit for planting the seed. I told them that being a parent in this line of work is not about applause. It's about constancy, about being there even when they don't want you to be. When the session ended, no one clapped right away. They just sat still, processing. Then one cadet, a tall girl with sharp cheekbones and a name tag that read M. Parker, stood and said, "Sir, if that's what being forgotten looks like, then maybe the rest of us should be so lucky." That was enough. Later that evening, I walked through the Naval Memorial Plaza again. This time I wasn't a visitor. I wasn't invisible. A staffer approached and asked if I'd sign a guest plaque that would be included in their annual Hall of Legacy exhibit. I wrote simply, "Not all battles are fought with medals. Some are won with silence and resolve." Admiral Richard Mercer, back in Washington, Elizabeth and I fell into a new rhythm. Not quite friends, not quite strangers. Learning again, but something in between. She called twice that week. The first time to ask about an operation she thought I might have helped shape. The second time just to say thank you. It was the first thank you I remember getting from her in over 20 years. And strangely, it didn't feel overdue. It felt on time. The following Monday, I received a manila envelope. Inside was a formal document confirmation of my Admiral Emeritus status, logged and recognized by the Joint Chiefs with a note from Admiral Keating. The silence has done its part. Now let the name carry what it's earned. I placed it in a drawer, not on a wall, not for display. A few days later, Elizabeth invited me to speak to her command unit. It was a closed-door session, no press, no ceremony. She introduced me simply, "This is Admiral Mercer. He's my father. And if any of you ever wondered where I learned how to lead now, you know." After the session, she stood beside me in the hallway. "You know," she said, "for most of my life I thought I was trying to prove I was better than you." I turned toward her. "And now I'm just proud I came from you." We didn't hug. We're not that kind of family. But her hand brushed my shoulder before she walked away, and that said more than any embrace. A week later, a letter arrived at my apartment, handwritten, no return address. Inside was a photograph. It showed me standing outside the gate at her ceremony weeks earlier. My shoulders were straight, my hands behind my back, my face unreadable. Scrawled at the bottom were 7 words. You never needed the list. You led it. I stared at it for a long time. Then I tucked it behind the White House letter in my desk drawer, and I went for a walk. The sun was just starting to set, painting the sky over the Potomac in shades of orange and silver. I passed uniformed officers in conversation, junior cadets jogging back from drills, old veterans sitting quietly on benches. And I thought to myself, maybe this is what victory really looks like. Not parades, not decorations, but peace. Peace with what was never said. Peace with who never understood. Peace with being overlooked until you couldn't be ignored anymore. Elizabeth once asked me what I wanted most out of life. At the time, I didn't answer, but I know now I wanted to be seen, not for what I wore or what I did, but for who I chose to be even when no one was looking. And now that I had that, not from the world, not even just from her, but from myself, that was enough. The uniform is folded now. The title is honorary. The work is done. But the name carries forward, not just in records, but in her voice, in the cadets who heard the truth, in the silence that no longer needs defending, and in a single word she spoke not out of duty, but out of love. Dad. That was the only rank I ever truly wanted, and I earned it.